All right. Welcome to Mentor Time, everybody. I hope today will be interesting for you. And as we start, for the new people, just a reminder, if you don't want to be on video, because this video will be available to people who can't come today and eventually will be on YouTube. The topic today is an update on the changing nature of work. Ron and Peter and Stephanie and maybe Ala remember the last one we did last fall. It was suggested that I might want to concentrate more on what the employer is dealing with. So I've tried to do that as much as possible. So here's the agenda. We're going to talk about what's been happening in 2022, predictions and expectations. Then we'll go on to what's changed and changing. And for those of you who are new, I send out a link to the recording and I'll send out the PowerPoint, a link to the PowerPoint files, because there are references in there if you want to click things. So what's changed and changing. And then I always end with what should you do or what can you do at this point. So we are ready to get started. I decided to put together every presentation that we started making since May 2021. We were talking in one of the mentor times, and those of you who've been with Ron and me for a while said, yeah, we'd like to know more about what's going on. Now, I'll remind you, June of 2021 was when Google, Apple, and others announced that they were going to be demanding people come back to work in September. That didn't always happen the way companies thought then. We had another one in December. Then you all know we all went through 2022. We had 4 different conversations about this, specifically on the changing nature of work and what we know, as you can see. So these are all recordings. If any of you want a historical view and want to look at them, just ping me and let me know which one you want, and I'd be glad for you to look at them. I follow Hannah Morgan, who runs Career Sherpa. She's one of the people I connected to early in the pandemic. She has a great Sunday newsletter. It goes out on LinkedIn as well. But I laughed last week when I opened her newsletter, because I read it every Sunday morning, and she said, this is the year of career cushioning, hunkering down. But she also said, these have to make the best of the situation. So if I have a tagline for today, it's employees still have a lot of power, the way they did a year ago at this time, a lot. But that power is waning and waning quickly, and the companies are getting back in control. A few statistics from the December Bureau of Labor and Statistics report is that payroll's up a little bit, and we all have heard over the last few months that we're still in very low unemployment. It's edged down a little bit, but it's not making huge gains. It's still 5 million people who are unemployed. People not in the workforce, but who want to be employed, I was surprised to see that it really hasn't changed from February 2020, which was actually locking down. So there's a lot of movement going on. We've talked about this before. We are seeing increases in employment still coming up. And as you'll see, just last month alone in December, there were over 700,000 people that were added to the payroll. There's a monthly newsletter that I get, and I can't even remember how I started getting it, but it's called WFH Research, Work from Home Research. They link to a report that they do from some surveys every time. And I thought it was useful to use their slides and show you on each slide. I've put the yellow highlight to show you what it is, because most of the graphs aren't that helpful, but the information is. This was the only data that I could find easily that showed a trend pre-pandemic, and that's why I wanted to put this here. What they were saying about this is that work from home has shifted many people into a higher startup rate because many people are doing startups. I think that what it showed people was the number of people that were willing to go it alone for better work-life balance, because they had to do it during the pandemic. Either they were let go and had to do it, or their company was retracting or working from home. They realized they could have a different life. That's my interpretation of it. This, I don't know. I didn't dig into the data. Google apparently tracking cell phones is saying that their January 2020 numbers show mobility and people being at the office. We all know that doesn't necessarily mean that's where they are. The message in this graph for me is the numbers are pretty consistent across countries where there are high income countries where we have a lot of mobility, and they're all stabilizing around a measure of work from home that bottomed out when we went into lockdown down below 60% to up about 30%. Last week also, LinkedIn shared an article that they wrote analyzing all of their content, and they have 5 different themes on this. I wanted to talk about it, not so much that it's factual. It's interesting that people post things, but we all know even on LinkedIn, all social media, there's a range of what gets posted. So the first is adjusting to the new reality. What this little highlight says is basically people are being told to come to the office, but because there are still some people that are hybrid, they're making everybody have meetings by Zoom anyway. I don't know how much I couldn't verify this fact, but it's something to think about. And it's certainly something we talked about preparing for, what, Ron, over a year ago. One of our first discussions was talked about making people bring their laptops to conference rooms for people working from home. The second, changing state of work culture. If you have a chance to glance through this report, it's interesting to look at. This is one of the 3 or 4 points. But what I liked about it, of course, was don't undervalue exceptional women, and all the women on this call are exceptional. I haven't been able to identify the peer-reviewed research they're referring to. Says that people will hire women who are overqualified for a job because they have their own biases about how hard it will be to retain them, which means women are maybe settling for or being asked to take a lesser job than they're qualified for because of people not offering them what they really should. I don't know much more than that. It's just provocative for today. The third area, an ongoing pandemic. And I was glad to see it say ongoing, because they have a graph later that says the pandemic's ending or has ended, which we know it hasn't. It's true. I think we've seen in 2022, as vaccinations and the number of people vaccinated and mortality and morbidity from COVID coming down, we've seen that people are talking about how to move forward. We all, I think, changed our habits. We went out more last year. I'm still masking just because I don't want to get colds and flu as well as COVID, but we're doing things differently and it's more forward-looking. The last 2, I think, are constant discussions on LinkedIn, empathy and leadership. And they're talking about all these LinkedIn members who are musing on how leaders need to be kind and empathetic in all of this. And my first reaction when I read this is, yeah, but there's a lot of bosses out there who aren't. So take it with a grain of salt. But everybody says that and talks about it. And someone will post saying, oh, the research shows that empathetic bosses have X or Y. But it doesn't necessarily change your workplace. And finally, the last one is so true, but it's constant. Almost every time Bill Gates writes a letter, or if Serena Williams writes, and she should write about her near death in her delivery with her maternal morbidity issue, those things get shared, and they should. And that's what LinkedIn is a great place for. What LinkedIn's saying is that LinkedIn members were listening and learning, because remember, this is LinkedIn's report and their own analysis of their content. What have we been seeing? 2022, and even in the last 3 weeks, huge numbers of layoffs, big companies. I'm going to go through them quickly. Alphabet, the parent company of Google, said they hired too fast during the pandemic. That's why they're letting things go. And at the end, I'll tell you what I think is really happening. Amazon apparently is cutting white collar employees, and we've known for a month and a half or 2 months, they are putting billions of dollars into the Alexa devices that, at least in my house, proliferate and we love most of the time, but they don't want to necessarily support them. They thought they would be good for shopping, and most of us don't use them for shopping. Microsoft is cutting its workforce. They said that they had planned for this, but look at what they're going on, refocusing strategy on AI and moving away from hardware. I guess I'll say it now. Google Meta, Microsoft, they're all betting the farm on AI. And I think they're getting rid of workers because they think that they've got solutions that mean they can be more efficient with fewer live bodies. Meta's laid off a lot. Their value of their stock is going down. But here's the thing. Every company I've mentioned is sitting on billions of dollars in profits. Their stock costs are still high. And in fact, as soon as they do a layoff, which I finally understand thanks to Kai Risdall on Marketplace a week or two ago, for some reason, layoffs cause stock prices to surge. I think it's related to the investors thinking, oh, they're going to be more efficient, so they'll make me more money. Salesforce, which has been everybody's darling for customer relationship management and all sorts of things, including monitoring and evaluation and global health, says they're looking at a challenging environment and are closing up some of their offices to cut spending. They're probably more realistic than the big companies I mentioned that are getting rid of people. I think they're doing it conveniently at the beginning of this year to go into a calendar year strong and trying to be efficient. And this comes back to what we heard earlier. Wayfair says, we just got too big. There were too many people wanting to renovate and buy things, and we met that demand, and now there is no more demand. So that's the lay of the land of where we're coming from. Let's look at now what's changed or what's continuing to change. These, again, all come from the work from home, and these slides 8 and 9 are the ones I'm going to show you, but I had to put this here because it says, as the pandemic ends. The big message is that work from home has been stable for about a year at about 30% of work days. When we begin to dig into it, here's the number of days that people are working from home, 2.3, for workers able to work from home. But the workers who can't, not surprisingly, they barely can work from home. So there's a huge gap in this. And we've talked about this, and we all know the workers, like my sister, who was an oncology nurse and had to go to work every day for kids with cancer. So there's still a gap between what workers want and what employers are willing to do. And it's coming to more of a hard line. Of the workers who are able to work from home, that solid line at the top says they want to be working at home up to 3 days a week or more. But employers are not willing to give them that. And that yellow represents a gap of almost 1 full workday. So you can imagine, and I won't try to quote statistics with Allah on here, but it definitely shows that there's a huge gap in what people desire. In a LinkedIn article, they analyzed their share of people who applied for jobs through LinkedIn and of job postings that LinkedIn has. I couldn't find the exact date, but I know about 1.5 years ago, LinkedIn made a concerted effort to start getting more job postings. And I know this because I work with mentees and I'm often looking at job postings with them. And we switched from Indeed to, oh, I found it on LinkedIn. So I would say from July 2022 is about the best way forward. The earlier stuff is just because LinkedIn really wasn't the place people posted things. This shows the number of job postings for what they're calling remote work and the number of people applying for those jobs. We have to remember throughout all this, remote has never been defined. Hybrid has never been defined, other than fully remote, which means not going to an office ever or maybe once a year. Everybody's got an analysis of this. The more important thing is that this lack of movement of more and more remote jobs is signaling that there's a change in the workforce. And in fact, this Washington Post writer, Abba Badarai, said, scaling back remote work policies is visible signs of a changing job market. And that for me, that means the job market is going to be either crunched because there won't be enough workers who agree to come back, or people who have no other option will be going into an office after a couple of years of more productive work on their part by working from home. And I think in the last 2 months of these big tech layoffs that have been coming, it certainly is giving all of us some pause about what are we going to do with our futures. This is just to point out to you the gap between the amount that the employer on the right wants to allow people to work from home versus the desire of workers on the left. And the two that I highlighted, 3 days a week and 5 days a week, are where there seem to be the biggest discrepancies of people who are not able to get 5 days a week or 3 days a week. Again, not a lot of detail. I could have read more of the report, but I didn't. So we're not surprised work from home still advantages the knowledge workers like me. They gave this graph, and I did an overlay with the brackets and the yellow. This is my categorization, a quick way to think about it. These top tier people who have a lot of work from home, they're all knowledge workers. They have portable ways they can work. The middle group is bigger. Healthcare and education are in there, but there's a part of healthcare and education that is more in-person than not, but it's mixed. This isn't necessarily easy categories, but this category could be work from home, could be hybrid. There are ways that they're doing this, and even the government has been not just calling it telecommuting, but actual work policies on working in a hybrid setting. And finally, as we know, during the pandemic, there's a lot of categories of service people and people who have front-facing jobs who cannot work from home or are only able to do it if they have to take a sick day. Consolidation from the pandemic effect, yes. And what we're seeing is we're landing at hybrid, some version of hybrid with no definition here, where people are attending Zoom meetings, sitting at an office, because companies, as we've talked about before, are sitting on a lot of real estate, because bosses think that there's much more serendipity of interchanges and brainstorming and creativity. I think we're not seeing a change there. And what we're going to have to figure out is how and in what way hybrid is or isn't working. I'm hoping the next few months will show us how much is really being done hybrid and how many workers are being asked to come in more and more frequently, meaning they started at 3 or 4 days a week, and now the company's saying you can only stay home once a week. This is just to remind us the implications of what happened during the pandemic that we're still seeing. We know that a lot of things we counted on, like the supply chain, we found the issues and the inconsistencies. There are repercussions. Yes, public transport is rebounding, but it's still below its pre-pandemic levels. So what does that mean? City and state governments may be collecting more road tax or less road tax, depending on which way the commute is going for people that aren't using public transport. Reduced public transport availability means people are disadvantaged if they don't have any other way to get to work. And all of those have budgetary issues also for state, local, and federal government. So what should you do? I don't have a lot of recommendations because it's all around think twice about leaving without a safety net. And I say this because a year ago in January 2022, there was the Great Resignation. None of the people I've worked with were in this position of suddenly up and resigning and trying to get a better job. So I don't know any real examples of what we kept hearing about. The way forward is what we talked about a week ago. Be prepared, be looking, be collecting, be tracking, and be using your stuff. And I wanted to remind you all, we've had MentorTime topics on some of these things that can help you navigate a rocky situation at work. But also, as you're beginning to think about what your next step is, certainly I've been working more and more with people who are doing side hustles, startups, trying to go out on their own, consulting, a range of whatever the non-employee relationships are. So lots of resources for you to look at if you're interested when I send out the link. I like to show the photos, even though I don't have to, I just want to give them credit. And I'll stop on these lovely photos and ask Ron comments, questions, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Wow. You cover a lot of material. That was pretty impressive. And actually, it's quite a few topics there. And we talked about job growth and things like that, like 700,000 in the States. I know 100 and some odd thousand in Canada. So in December, things were happening that the economists weren't expecting. And this is causing confusion around things. But the other side of it is you saw, especially in the tech sector, a lot of jobs disappearing. Now, I'm curious, it sounded like these were actual people being told, given their pink slips. So that's not the same as saying we created a bunch of jobs that we couldn't fill, because that's true too. I think it's similar in the United States. In Canada, there were 1 million jobs unfilled, and there are 1 million people looking for work. That sounds like that should fit out just nicely, but it's a mismatch or mislocation, misskills, whatever. It's just not working. And I'm presuming in the States, it's probably in the 10 million range, because typically it's 10 times in the States that it is in Canada. So you've got that kind of situation. And because jobs were being posted and not filled, those jobs are disappearing too, probably, as they're saying, oh, we're not going to fill that job. And then we're laying people off as well. So the desire or the intentions of employers to bring on staff, and now they're not going to fill those positions because it looks like it's not going to happen anyway. Plus, they're taking a risk-averse stance by saying, I'm going to prepare for the possible recession, the probable recession, whatever that thing is that's coming towards us. But certainly it's an economic slowdown of some kind, and that's causing the challenges for everyone. One of the interesting things I came across this week, Sue, that I don't know whether you had seen and the rest of us, is knowledge workers, you too can be replaced by AI. And there has been a really interesting discussion going on in various parts of the internet over how AI is doing the writing task as well as, if not, and sometimes better than the human counterpart. And to the point where universities are starting to get worried about plagiarized work. And it's not plagiarized. I'm stealing from this person. I'm stealing from a bot. I'm getting a robot to write my work for me, and they're now having to figure out how they can countermand this sort of stuff. That's a good news, bad news story. What it says to me is the opportunity presents itself for employers to say, I need a report written on such and such, and all you have to do is throw data at the robot, and the robot comes up with a report. Maybe I need to tweak it, and so my secretary can do that. And so I no longer need a data gatherer and a researcher. Now, I may be overstating it, but that is the way things might be going. And how important it is that you can write well when a robot can do it as well. Remember the time when schools argued about whether calculators belong in the schools? Robots belong in the schools. I don't know, but I think we've seen this story before. And I'm just wondering whether that's where we're going. Anyway, I've said enough. It's an exciting topic, in my opinion. It's exciting.
Well, I'll have to tell you that ChatGPT has been all over parts of LinkedIn for a couple months. Yesterday, there was someone, a real thought leader who works at Atlassian, and she posted that a friend of hers, a professor, was asking about how to cite work done by ChatGPT. I gave them, based on the citing document that I've done, I said it's a derivative product, blah, blah, blah. Today, I was on the office hours for everything data viz and wonderful spreadsheets and PowerPoints. We were talking about the fact that we may not be replaceable because you have to be able to articulate the question adequately for ChatGPT to be, and that's what we were working through with different problems brought to office hours. I think a lot of the tech layoffs are, again, because ChatGPT came much more quickly than everybody other than Google. ChatGPT came along much quicker than everybody 3 months ago thought was going to happen with AI and with this writing. If you look at some of the writing, though, it can be very generic. And the discussions right now are, yes, plagiarism. That bot is using internet-related material. So whose material are they using? And then what is the focus? It's hard enough right now where marketing people write marketing and press stuff with templates and just change the name of a company. Now we're going to get the same thing. And I don't know who's going to be paying for that kind of work, or maybe they're just going to pray and spray. I had forgotten that marketers say they do pray and spray, meaning now with email, they've been able to send things everywhere. I think that certainly Microsoft has wanted to get out of the hardware business, going into AI. Google's in AI, metaverse, Mark Zuckerberg's in that. But everybody's been aware of it. It's just a question of how much can we trust that to do, like computers. And as you were saying, I forgot about calculators, but I was around then too. I'm going to open this up. Questions, comments, thoughts about how this affects you, or things that I left off of the few things I gave you to think about doing for yourself?
I had a comment and then a question. I heard a pre-COVID interview with Melinda Gates, and all she talked about, most of what she talked about was AI. So that does seem it for most of her 30 or 40-minute interview. So I thought that was a flag for me that that is important and where she's headed. And then I really appreciate your statistics, because working in the government with nobody having come back, it's very difficult to tell what's going on the outside. And so it sounds like the private sector has arrived on 2 to 3 days of being in the office in this hybrid environment. When you looked at your statistics, looked at all the information you put in the presentation, is that most of the workforce having come back except for government and parts of academia? Because I have a family member that's in academia, and she said that most of the university where she works hasn't come back either, that they're all working from home.
I think it depends on the situation. The universities, Stephanie, you and I have talked about this, and Sarah, the universities can't afford not to have people on campus. They have even more real estate than, or as much as Apple building its new building 3 years ago, and same with Zuckerberg. The work from home, though, you have to differentiate it by who's doing what kind of work.
Okay.
So what the statistics showed is the average is about 2.3 days per week. And about, say, 3 days a week for those who are able to work from home, however that's done. And we know that's a pool. It's a big pool of people who are doing 1 or doing 5 or doing 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off. Who knows? The digital nomads, Ron and Peter and I were talking about this just before we started the recording. The digital nomads, though, are still there. And Airbnb, for example, and communities are finding ways to change their rules about how long you can rent your house for because of the long-term Airbnb requests that have been coming through. I think what the take-home message is, the companies are back in force and back in charge. And the only thing you can do is vote with your feet. You either don't go to that company or you leave the company if you want a fully remote job. I have heard of, mostly through mentees or whatever I'm reading, heard of some that have decided to try different approaches to a work week. So someone I know who was being asked to come to the office and said, nope, I'll work remotely. And they're letting her. But they also now decided to try for the entire company a 4-day work week. And that way everybody has a 3-day weekend. That was 2 months ago. And she said it's working out pretty well. So the pandemic's at least brought us different dimensions of ways to ask for how to get what basically this phrase doesn't really capture it, but work-life balance. How do you get what you need, the best of both worlds? I agree. It's nice to go into an office sometimes, but since I retired, I've done all of my work virtually, and a lot of people do. I think, Stephanie, though, what's of interest to me is that the companies are not yet making the complaint, which may surface in this calendar year if they're in calendar year budgets. They are not making the complaint that they're sitting on all this real estate, and that's why they didn't make as many stock gains in public companies. I suspect we're going to start hearing it, though, because those things are long-term leases, and they've only been able to justify having them by the number of people coming into the office. Someone just let me know the other day that the job that she's applied for or is being interviewed for is fully remote. And this is a very large global health company, and they are already getting rid of their real estate. So they're going totally virtual, which makes sense since most of our work is virtual.
It's interesting, Sue. For the first time in my life, I had a job posting pushed at me through LinkedIn. Airbnb is looking for a curriculum design person, and it's all remote work. I'm not looking, but it was pushed at me, and it's remote work. And of course, Airbnb is a remote work company. So this is real. It's out there. And I think the startling thing is what can actually become remote work. Retail, we think of retail as face-to-face. Well, Amazon proved that not to be true, and so on. And I think we're in a very interesting time. Isn't that a Chinese curse? We're in an interesting time, which is things are going to continue to flux. I think the COVID, and I think your graphs showed it perfectly, is COVID accelerated certain things, and startups, the idea of people, I can actually be my own boss. And so that kind of idea, and some of the people we've worked with have made that same conclusion, is that I would rather be my own contractor. And I guess, Peter, in some ways, that's how you work, is that I can be my own boss. I can do contract work, and that's how I want to work. I've actually worked with some of my mentees, young professionals, and we toyed with that idea. I'm finding it trouble just to get that right job, and yet I can get lots of little jobs. So the question is do I want to take the risk and manage the business of trying to seek new work all the time while I'm doing other work? And so that's the challenge of being your own boss, but you get certain type of freedom, like you're not going to set my hours. And that's what we're talking about here.
Great, Ron. Thanks. Any other comments or questions or observations?
I have a question. What have you found as like a compelling reason why why companies want people back in the office?
I don't find it a compelling reason, but the reason that we heard from late 2020 to now has been when people are together, there's much more creativity. You have more efficiencies because you can walk down the hall and have a chat. You can get your business development proposals done more quickly. I don't find that compelling, but
Is there data on that? Because that's what
no,
I've heard.
there are no slides in the work from home research I showed you, but what would be helpful to me, last year, one of the presentations that we discussed this topic on said that there was a huge mistrust by managers of people actually being productive at home. And yet that's how they had to judge them. I think the one we did in October was when I found the data showing that people were working from home were starting to get sidelined out of meetings just because there were so many people in the office. So Carrie, I agree with you. There's no compelling reason. And if they want to be an empathetic boss who can lead by trust and lead by giving people the opportunity to grow, then you would think that they would understand that. And many of us on this call work in global health, where we worked for years with people that we had phone conferences on and occasional visits. So I don't have any. That's the short and the long of it, if anybody else has anything to add.
Yeah, I have a theory, because I was thinking exactly that question, Carrie, about it. And I have a theory, and it needs to be tested. During my thesis work way back when, in the 80s, I came across some findings that were absolutely profound in favor of a certain approach to things. It was in the training domain, but the point is the findings were absolutely phenomenally pointing in one direction. It didn't get implemented. And the reason it didn't get implemented had to do with the bosses. And it had to do with the supervisors, because the supervisors had an attitude which impeded the implementation of the good practices. I won't get into the details of it. Go read my thesis. But the issue, I think, is similar here, is good practices, best practices, effective practices. I have seen it reported that when people are working from home, they actually are more efficient. Now, I can't quote any stats on it, but there are some indicators that this is true. And so the challenge then comes down, I believe, is the bosses have an attitude, and the attitude is creating the fact. And so I think there's a bias there going on. I could be wrong, but I think this would make somebody a great PhD thesis. And this year could be the year to do that study.
Yeah. And it's more than attitude. Remember, most of these bosses grew up being bossed like that. That's the only model they know how to do. And I think that's some of what we're seeing. And I'm hoping younger bosses coming in who have to respond to Gen Z workers who value more than anything the work-life balance, and companies and work with a mission, is, I remember in one of the last two presentations, are important to this generation. So the 5-generation workplace is still very viable, but the bosses have to manage themselves and manage the company differently to keep those people. We know that there are people that are not taking jobs even when they're available. And it's not just retail workers and service workers. It is knowledge workers. They don't necessarily want to be going to do certain things anymore. Does that help you?
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Anybody else?
I have a comment/question if anyone found data around this. I wonder how this whole shift working from home and having real estate and these companies or even academic institution having these real estate or owning these real estate affects budgets that goes into, for example, public health interventions. So what I work, for example, right now, even in my previous position, they've reduced the amount of people who work from the office, which mean whole floors or whole units and buildings are gone. People are working from home. They reinvented these spaces to do other things. Right now, where I work, they want to reduce the rooms, putting people instead of individual offices or single offices into joint spaces. So I wonder how all of that is affecting administrative money taken from all these grants. How would that affect actually how much money is going into actual interventions that we wrote these NIH grants for? Instead of a university taking up to, in some cases, 60 to 70% administrative
Hi.
fees, would that change? Also, would it change in terms of providing more support for people to do more actual research work? Statisticians, epidemiologists, specifically research coordinators who are the lowest paid in that scale, because that's something we're struggling with. So we have empty offices. We want to reduce it. There is money coming out of there, but that money is not going to actually staffing. It's going back to the administrative fees. But there's a refusal, and I've seen that throughout, not just where I work. I've been talking to different friends around the nations around how they're dealing with it. Exactly the same situation. We're reducing space, joining spaces. People are not working, but we're not getting any salary increases, or the maximum you're going to get 1% to 3 maximum percent, which is not. I had to actually sit with HR and explain to them that, guess what? Yes, this is what's happening based on the data. You're saying inflation is 6 to 10%, but reality based on the data we've collected from receipts from employees and how cost of living, rents, and all of that is not 10%. It's actually 33% in the real world for people. So I wonder how that shift is is it gonna go to personnel, or just is gonna go to profits to universities or academic institution or research?
A couple things, a couple principles. Overheads by universities and private companies and even not-for-profits are established and agreed upon with the government. So those things are not changed very often. They try very hard not to, and they can't always get a raise in one. And the conventional wisdom for many years has been, oh, universities are so expensive because their overhead's so high. Universities can't just say, my lease is up in the downtown white building and we're not going to take the 7th and 8th floor anymore. They sit on actual property that most of the time they own if it's a private university, or the government owns if it's public state, for example. The way in which the allocations will get better for workers will be, I think, from two pressures. One is when this starts to settle out in a few years, we may see efficiencies from less actual real estate used by companies, people, whatever, in universities, in private companies. So that big monthly rent, yearly rent, whatever, will be a big piece of change that comes back to the university in some fashion. The second opposing part of that, though, is also pressure on wages. I just saw that one of the states has mandated a $15 minimum wage for the workers. And we still have, I think, the awareness now that people aren't being paid living wages. But we're in a point where it's still very high on the employer side. They've got tons of costs they're covering, and not many more productivity gains. Going from typewriter to computer, we had a lot of productivity gains. So I think it's going to take a while, but what you're talking about with a specific cadre of employee has built up over time for decades of, we can't pay so-and-so because they only do that, meaning the cadre of workers. I know that during the pandemic, we became more aware of it as a country in the global workforce. And my hope is that the gains we've started to make, such as recognizing that people in Africa and Asia and Latin America who are experts who are in their own country can be paid by USAID, the same rate as a global consultant like I used to be, instead of being considered host country national was the old term for it, or even third country nationals. If we can start to get those discussions going. So the short answer is, Ala, it won't be anytime soon. I don't know that there's data specifically on what you want, but certainly there's a lot of analyses about how companies, universities, and NGOs basically hide their profits. And there are some real costs to having a university. I remember when I worked at the part of Johns Hopkins I worked at for 10 years. There's a lot of people to feed off that one budget recovery that we got from our grants from AID and NIH. Hope that helps you, Ron.
Yeah, anyway, just your question actually reminded me about the idea. I'm going to do this quickly since we're getting close to the end of our time.
Well,
is that it's called the hollowing out of cities. And what's happening is a lot of the downtown office space is empty. So there's pressure on companies to fill it. And so it may be part of the impetus to the earlier question about why do they want people back? Well, they've got this real estate, they're sitting on it, but the leases are being let go. And there's been a bit of work done in both Toronto and Ottawa looking at some of the issues of hollowing out the center. And the real data, the real indicator of it is that restaurants who are open for the purposes of serving the lunchtime crowd in the downtown core are having to close because there's not enough business. And the reason there's not enough business is because people are not there. They're working from home, they're doing other things. The other thing you showed, Sue, was a stat on public transit coming back. Same issue. Public transit, I used to carpool because there's 4 of us going into town. Now none of my colleagues are going into town. I'm going in my one day. I'm in my car by my lonesome, or that because there's not enough public transit for it. So there's a lot of issues. And so universities are going to feel it. For-profit businesses are going to feel it. Town core restaurants are going to feel it. And it's going to be, like I said, interesting times.
For sure. Great. All right. I am going to not check in with the chat box since we're over time. So if someone has a burning issue, put it in the chat or send me an email. And I will be in touch with you for the February schedule and we'll go from there. Ron, how about closing the meeting today?
Wow. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This has been a big group. Sometimes there's only a couple of us here, so it's lovely to have all of you here. Thanks, Sue, for that wonderful data collection and the sharing of that. That was really good. And I look forward to meeting the rest of you the next time we get together for Mentor Time. Thanks very much. This is great.
All right. Thank you, everyone. See you soon.